There is a particular quality to the island of Corsica in summer. The air carries the scent of wild maqui, that dense, fragrant scrubland of rosemary, lavender, and rock rose that covers the hillsides like a green sea. The sun is fierce, the light is sharp, and the mountains rise steeply behind the coastal towns, as though the island itself is bracing against the weight of the world. The people of Corsica are proud people, Mediterranean to their bones, stubborn as the granite beneath their feet, shaped by centuries of struggle against Genoese overlords and foreign ambition. It was here, in this rugged, beautiful, complicated place, on the 15th of August, 1769, that a child was born who would one day make emperors tremble. His parents named him Napoleone Bonaparte. He came into the world in the city of Ajaccio, the second son of Carlo Buonaparte and Letizia Ramolino. He was small at birth, but furious with life, and that combination, small and furious, would define him for the rest of his days. His father, Carlo, was a charming and somewhat opportunistic man. A lawyer by training, he was intelligent, socially ambitious, and not above adjusting his allegiances when the political winds shifted. For years, Carlo had supported the great Corsican patriot Pasquale Paoli in his rebellion against Genoa. And then, when France purchased Corsica from Genoa in 1768 and crushed the rebellion, Carlo pivoted. He made peace with the French authorities. He learned to navigate the new colonial administration. He used his legal skills and his noble lineage, however modest, to secure advantages for his family. It was a pragmatic choice, and not without its costs to his reputation among fiercer Corsican patriots. But Carlo Bonaparte was above all else a man who wanted his family to rise. And then there was his mother, Letizia. She was something else entirely. Where Carlo was warm and flexible, Letizia was iron. She was a woman of extraordinary self-discipline, physical toughness. Legend has it she was riding a horse through mountain terrain while pregnant with Napoleon, and a moral severity that brooked no self-pity. She raised her children with love, yes, but love tempered by the understanding that life was hard, and that those who could not endure hardship would be crushed by it. She had 13 children in total, though several died young. She outlived Napoleon himself, and in old age, when asked about the rise and fall of her famous son, she reportedly said only, "provided it lasts." She had always known, perhaps better than anyone, that nothing built in haste on the back of ambition lasts forever. Napoleon was baptized a Catholic, as all Corsicans were, but his early religious feeling was more ethnic than devout. The church was part of Corsican life, part of the rhythm of festivals and funerals and feast days, but Napoleon would grow into a man who saw religion as a social institution rather than a spiritual one. Useful for governing, less interesting for the soul. As a young child, Napoleon ran wild through the streets and hills of Ajaccio. He was, by all accounts, a difficult boy, argumentative, hot-tempered, intensely competitive, and possessed of a pride that could shade into arrogance. He fought often, usually winning, and he organized his playmates into mock military units with himself naturally in command. He was also, however, deeply curious. He read obsessively. He loved maps. He loved stories of ancient battles. He asked questions constantly and grew impatient with adults who couldn't answer them well. The family's circumstances were not wealthy, but Carlo had managed to secure recognition of their minor noble status from the French authorities, which opened certain doors. One of those doors led to a military scholarship. In 1779, at just 9 years old, Napoleon was sent to the military preparatory school at Autun, in France, to learn the French language. He had spoken only Corsican Italian until then. He was a foreigner in his own empire, and the other students made sure he knew it. After a few months at Autun, Napoleon was transferred to the Royal Military School at Brienne-le-Château in Champagne, where he would spend the next 5 years. Brienne was a world away from Corsica in every sense. The climate was cold and gray, the social world was rigid and hierarchical. The other boys, mostly sons of French noble families, looked down on Napoleon for his foreign accent, his inferior social standing, his poverty, and his Corsican origins. They mocked him. They called him the foreigner. They made his life, in its social dimensions, frequently miserable. And what did Napoleon do? He did what he would always do when the world came at him. He hardened. He studied. He found the one domain where no one could mock him or outrank him on merit alone, and he mastered it absolutely. That domain was mathematics. Napoleon was not merely good at mathematics, he was exceptional. His geometric intuition was almost frightening. He could hold spatial relationships in his mind the way a musician holds melody, naturally, without effort. And this gift, combined with his obsessive study of history, particularly military history, made him the finest student in artillery and tactics that Brienne had ever seen. He also discovered, during those cold years in Champagne, something that would feed his imagination for the rest of his life: the idea of Corsican independence and the heroic figure of Pasquale Paoli. Napoleon read everything he could find about Paoli. He idealized the man as a patriot and a warrior. He dreamed of himself one day liberating Corsica. It is one of history's great ironies that the boy who wanted most to free his island would end his life having conquered half of Europe and never truly belonging to any of it. At 15, Napoleon was transferred to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, France's elite military academy. He completed in 1 year what was normally a 2-year course. His examiners, including the great mathematician and scientist Pierre-Simon Laplace, were struck by his abilities. He graduated in September 1785 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the French artillery. He was 16 years old. His first posting was to the artillery regiment at Valence in southern France. And here we get our first glimpse of Napoleon's daily life as a young officer, and it was not glamorous. He lived in extremely modest lodgings. He ate simply, often very little, surviving on bread and cheap wine while he spent his money on books. He read voraciously and indiscriminately: history, philosophy, geography, law, economics, novels. He read Plutarch's Lives of the Ancient Greeks and Romans and was transfixed. He read Voltaire and Rousseau and the other philosophers of the Enlightenment. He read about Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and Hannibal, mapping their campaigns in his mind the way another young man might replay the moves of a chess match. He also wrote. During these years, Napoleon produced essays, political pamphlets, and at least one unfinished novel, all of them marked by passion and ambition and a prose style that was dense, fervent, and somewhat breathless. He was not a great writer, but he was a great thinker on paper, and the habit of thinking through his ideas in written form would serve him enormously as a military planner. His battle plans were masterpieces of written reasoning. He spent these early years shuttling between his regiment and Corsica, where family business repeatedly called him back. His father Carlo had died of stomach cancer in 1785. And as the eldest surviving son, his older brother Joseph was present but temperamentally unsuited to leadership. Napoleon increasingly became the de facto head of the family. He was ferociously devoted to his mother and siblings, particularly to his younger brother Lucien and to his sister Alessa. This fierce family loyalty would remain with him always, and would also become one of the great complications of his empire, filling it with relatives who were often incompetent, ungrateful, or both. Then came the Revolution. In 1789, France exploded. The political, social, and economic contradictions of the old regime, the Ancien Regime, with its rigid hierarchy of king, church, and nobility, collapsed under the weight of financial crisis, popular fury, and the radical new ideas of liberty and equality that the philosophers had spent a century planting in the culture. The Bastille fell in July. The old world cracked apart, and Napoleon, watching from the fringes, felt something he had never felt before in France: opportunity. The revolution did not immediately benefit him. In fact, the early years of the revolutionary period found Napoleon deeply confused, drawn to the Corsican independence movement of Paoli, now returned from exile, while also feeling the pull of France's transforming political energy. He tried to navigate both worlds and nearly destroyed himself in the process. He was involved in a disastrously botched military adventure in Corsica in 1792. Paoli turned against him. The Bonaparte family was declared traitors to Corsica and had to flee to France in 1793 with almost nothing. Napoleon was 23 years old, a refugee, his childhood dream of Corsican glory gone. He never went back. But France was at war. Revolutionary France had declared war on much of monarchical Europe, and Europe was fighting back. And France needed officers, competent ones, desperately. The mass emigration of aristocratic officers had created catastrophic vacancies in the military command structure. Into those vacancies rose men of talent without birth, men like Napoleon. His moment came at Toulon. The great southern port city had fallen to royalist rebels who had invited in a British fleet. The Republic needed it back urgently, and the artillery officer in charge of the operation was incompetent. Napoleon appeared on the scene, assessed the situation with his characteristic rapid clarity, and proposed a bold, unconventional plan. Rather than attacking Toulon directly, capture the heights that dominated the harbor and force the British fleet to withdraw. His superiors were initially skeptical, but they had no better ideas. Napoleon's plan was approved. He executed it with extraordinary energy, personally directing gun placements, working around the clock, inspiring soldiers through sheer force of will and physical example. When one of his senior officers was wounded, Napoleon took command completely. Toulon fell. The British fleet fled. The Republic was saved in the south, and a young general named Augustin Robespierre, brother of the Revolution's most powerful man, Maximilien Robespierre, wrote to Paris about the young artillery officer whose genius had made it happen. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. He was 24 years old, but the winds of the revolution were treacherous. In the summer of 1794, Robespierre fell. The Thermidorian reaction ended the terror in a single bloody coup. Napoleon, associated with the Robespierre faction, was briefly arrested. It was a moment of genuine danger. He was imprisoned for nearly 2 weeks, then released when the charges couldn't be substantiated. He had narrowly escaped the guillotine through a combination of luck, timing, and the simple fact that he was more useful alive than dead. The next year or so was a period of professional uncertainty and personal restlessness. He was temporarily removed from the artillery, briefly posted to a role he found beneath him, and at one point nearly dispatched to a dismal posting in the Vendée. He was broke, often going hungry, subsisting on his meager salary and occasional loans from his brother Joseph. He roamed Paris in worn boots and a threadbare coat, looking for advancement, writing proposals, attending salons, scheming. And in those salons, he met a woman. Josephine de Beauharnais was 6 years older than Napoleon, a widow with 2 children born in Martinique in the Caribbean, stylish and sensuous and surrounded by the sophisticated society of post-terror Paris. Her first husband had been a French nobleman who was guillotined during the Revolution. She herself had spent time in prison during the Terror, awaiting execution. She had emerged from that experience with a certain philosophy of life, elegant, pleasure-seeking, emotionally cautious, and politically shrewd. She was, in the circles that mattered, enormously well-connected. Napoleon met her in late 1795 and was immediately, helplessly, entirely in love. He wrote her letters that were embarrassing in their intensity, volcanic love letters in which this ferociously self-controlled young general exposed a need so raw it seems almost to have surprised him. "I awake full of you," he wrote. "Your image and the intoxicating pleasures of last night allow my senses no rest." Josephine, for her part, was fond of him. She admired his intelligence and his obvious greatness in the making. But she was not, it seems, in love with him in the same way. Not then, perhaps not ever. It was, for Napoleon, the great emotional asymmetry of his life. They married in March of 1796. 2 days later, Napoleon left to take command of the Army of Italy. The Italian campaign of 1796 and 97 was the campaign that announced Napoleon to the world. He arrived in the Alps to find his army in catastrophic shape, hungry, poorly equipped, demoralized, with officers who were older than him and deeply skeptical of this young Parisian interloper. What he proceeded to do was nothing short of miraculous. In 12 months, Napoleon won 14 significant engagements against Austrian and Piedmontese forces in a campaign of breathtaking operational fluency. He moved with a speed that paralyzed his enemies. He concentrated overwhelming force at the decisive point, then dispersed before the enemy could concentrate against him. He understood, in a way that most 18th-century commanders did not, that the army's ability to move quickly was itself a weapon, perhaps the most powerful weapon of all. But it was not only tactics. Napoleon had an instinctive genius for what we might call the human dimension of command. He knew his men. He ate their food, slept near them, shared their hardships. He walked among them before battles and afterward, touching their faces, calling veterans by name, promoting those who showed courage on the spot. His soldiers, les grognards, the grumblers, as they would come to call themselves, loved him with a ferocity that went far beyond normal military loyalty. He was not simply their general, he was their emperor of possibility, the proof that courage and talent could conquer any obstacle. He also wrote his soldiers addresses that were magnificent pieces of inspirational rhetoric. Standing before his army in April of 1796, ragged and hungry at the foot of the Alps, he told them, "Soldiers, you are naked and ill-fed. The government owes you much but can give you nothing. The richness of Italy will open before you. Conquer it." It was a promise and a challenge at once, and his army believed it, and then they made it true. By the time the Italian campaign ended, Austria had been forced to the peace table. Napoleon had reorganized northern Italy into a series of French client republics. He had seized enormous wealth, art, gold, resources, and sent much of it to Paris, making himself a hero to the Directory government that ruled France. He had also, quietly and systematically, begun to act as an independent political power, negotiating treaties without waiting for instructions from Paris, making decisions that were properly those of a government rather than a general. He was 27 years old, and he was already too powerful to fully control. Now came Egypt. The Directory, nervous about Napoleon's popularity in France, was delighted to send him far away on an exotic imperial adventure. Napoleon's own motivations were complex. Genuine scientific curiosity, a romantic identification with Alexander the Great, and perhaps a sense that the Orient offered something Europe could not, a stage vast enough for his ambitions. In 1798, he sailed for Egypt with an army of 35,000 soldiers and an extraordinary cohort of scientists, scholars, mathematicians, artists, and engineers, the so-called Commission des Sciences des Arts, whose mission was to study and document ancient Egypt. The military campaign was mixed. Napoleon destroyed the Mamluk armies at the Battle of the Pyramids with efficient brutality, standing before his troops and invoking the monuments of antiquity in one of history's most famous pre-battle speeches. "Soldiers, from the summit of these pyramids, 40 centuries of history look down upon you." He took Cairo, he imposed French administration, but then the British Admiral Horatio Nelson found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay and annihilated it, cutting Napoleon's army off from France. The Egyptian campaign became a strategic trap Napoleon fought on. He attempted to expand northward through Syria, was stopped at the siege of Acre by the British and Ottoman defenders, and turned back. Disease, plague, dysentery, ophthalmia ravaged his army. The situation was deeply difficult, and yet even in those circumstances, Napoleon organized the scientific work that would eventually produce the monumental Description de l'Égypte, 23 volumes of art, science, history, and observation that fundamentally transformed the Western world's understanding of ancient civilization. The Rosetta Stone was discovered by a French officer during this campaign. It would eventually lead to the decipherment of hieroglyphics. But Napoleon was also watching France, and in the summer of 1799, what he saw alarmed him. The Directory was corrupt, ineffective, and increasingly unpopular. France was losing the wars it had restarted after the Campo Formio peace. The country seemed to be drifting toward political collapse. Napoleon made a decision that was either extraordinarily bold or extraordinarily reckless, depending on how it turned out. He abandoned his army in Egypt, boarded a ship in secret, and sailed for France. He arrived in October of 1799 to scenes of public jubilation. He was the hero of Italy, the romantic adventurer of Egypt, and the people of France were desperate for capable leadership. He moved quickly. On the 18th Brumaire of the revolutionary calendar, November 9, 1799, Napoleon and his conspirators staged a coup d'état against the Directory. There was a moment of high farce at the Council of 500 in St. Cloud when Napoleon was surrounded by angry legislators who tore at his uniform and pushed him, and he had to be physically carried from the room by his brother Lucien and their soldiers. But Lucien saved the day with a masterstroke of improvisation, claiming from horseback that the council had been terrorized by armed brigands. The soldiers believed their general, or preferred to. The coup succeeded, the Directory fell, the consulate rose in its place, and at the head of it, as first consul, was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was 30 years old. What he built in the decade that followed is one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of governance. Napoleon was not merely a general. He was a state builder of extraordinary capacity, and the domestic reforms he implemented in his years of power reshaped France, and through France, much of the world, in ways that still echo today. The Napoleonic Code, the great reorganization of French civil law, was his central domestic achievement. Legal scholars, lawyers, and philosophers had debated for years how to rationalize the bewildering patchwork of feudal laws, regional customs, and revolutionary legislation that governed France. Napoleon brought them to a table, chaired the sessions himself with extraordinary energy and attention to detail, reportedly correcting legal experts on points of law with such precision that they were astonished, and within 4 years produced a unified, coherent, rational legal code based on the principles of equality before the law, property rights, and religious tolerance. The Napoleonic Code was subsequently adopted or adapted across Europe, Latin America, and much of the world, and its influence on modern legal systems is incalculable. He reorganized the French educational system, creating the lycée, state secondary schools that provided rigorous standardized education across France. He established the Bank of France to stabilize the currency and manage public finances. He reorganized the tax collection system, imposing order on a chaos that had bankrupted every previous French government. He negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII, ending the bitter conflict between the French state and the Catholic Church that had festered since the Revolution, and normalizing the role of religion in French public life. He reorganized the French departmental administration into the system of prefects, appointed administrators responsible for each region, that France still uses today. His daily routine during these years was astonishing by any measure. Napoleon slept rarely and unpredictably, often no more than 4 hours at night, with brief naps during the day. He worked from early morning, often beginning with correspondence and military dispatches before 5 in the morning. He dressed quickly. He was famously impatient with the ceremony of dressing, often pulling on his clothes in a matter of minutes while secretaries read dispatches aloud to him. He ate rapidly too, sometimes completing a meal in 8 or 10 minutes, which horrified his household staff but was simply the expression of his larger temperament. Time was the one resource that could never be replenished, and he resented wasting even a moment of it. He dictated at extraordinary speed, often to multiple secretaries simultaneously, pausing one mid-sentence to begin dictating to another, then returning to the first without losing his thread. His secretaries, men like Meneval and Fane, who served him for years, were in awe of this capacity. He could dictate a detailed strategic memorandum and simultaneously discuss a domestic policy question and attend to a personal correspondence, apparently without diminishing the quality of any of them. He was not, in temperament, an easy man to work for. He had a ferocious temper and expressed it explosively, sometimes hurling objects, shouting, turning on subordinates with a tirade of cutting, contemptuous language. But the storms passed quickly, and he was perfectly capable of charm and even tenderness. His personal magnetism was legendary. People who met him for the first time, even people who went in predisposed to dislike him, were frequently disarmed by the intensity of his presence. He had the quality that the French call séduction in its root sense, the ability to draw people entirely into his orbit. He was also, in his personal habits, surprisingly simple. He liked hot baths, very hot, almost scalding, and he would remain in them for a long time, thinking and dictating, sometimes having a secretary sit beside the bath reading reports to him. He liked roasted chicken and simple French cooking. He drank little wine and was contemptuous of men who drank too much. He took snuff compulsively, going through enormous quantities of it, and his clothes were often marked with snuff stains that his valet despaired of. He played chess passionately, though not particularly well. He played impatiently, which is not ideal for chess. He rode enthusiastically, though again not with the refined technique of a trained equestrian, preferring to ride fast and hard over terrain that well-trained cavalry officers found alarming. His relationship with Josephine had evolved into something complicated and emotionally charged. He had discovered during the Italian campaign that she was conducting an affair with a young cavalry officer named Hippolyte Charles, and the news had devastated him, cracking open in a young man of 27 a wound of humiliation and grief that never quite healed. He had written her desolate letters from Italy. "I am suffering. My love for you is the one thing that can still make me wretched." He had also, in response, begun his own series of affairs, something he would pursue throughout his life, not out of pure appetite, but also, it seems, partly out of the need to recover some of the pride that Josephine's betrayal had cost him. And yet they did not divorce. Despite everything, Napoleon remained profoundly attached to Josephine, to her grace, her social intelligence, her ability to create around her a world of beauty and ease that was the opposite of everything military and brutal about his life. She was his emotional anchor, even as she was the source of some of his greatest pain. He called her Ma douce Josephine. He came back to her again and again, and she, as the years passed, grew genuinely devoted to him, understanding perhaps too late that this difficult, brilliant, volcanic man had loved her as deeply as he had ever been capable of loving anyone. The one great absence in their marriage was children. Josephine had two from her first marriage, Eugène and Hortense, whom Napoleon adored and treated as his own. But she and Napoleon produced no child together. This lack preyed on Napoleon increasingly, because without a legitimate heir, his dynasty was insecure. What would happen to France, to the empire he was building, if he were to die in battle? Because war was always with him. War was the constant ground of his existence, the context within which everything else unfolded. In 1800, crossing the Alps in one of history's most audacious military moves, Napoleon brought his army through the Great St. Bernard Pass and fell on an Austrian army that thought itself secure in northern Italy. The Battle of Marengo in June of 1800 was nearly a catastrophe. Napoleon was losing the battle in the afternoon when a French corps under General Desaix arrived on the field and turned disaster into triumph. Desaix was killed in that final charge. When the news reached him, Napoleon reportedly went pale and said nothing for a long time. It was one of the few moments in these years when something of the cost of war seemed to break through the armor of his command persona. Peace was made with Austria in 1801, the Peace of Luneville. Peace was made with Britain in 1802, the Peace of Amiens. For a brief, shimmering period, the wars seemed to be over. Napoleon reorganized his government. He was made first consul for life in 1802, and then, in May of 1804, he was proclaimed Emperor of the French. The Senate and the people voted overwhelmingly in favor. In December of 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Paris, before the Pope himself, who had traveled to bless the occasion. Napoleon placed the imperial crown upon his own head, an act of breathtaking symbolic arrogance, telling the world that his authority came not from God or church or tradition, but from himself and the people who chose him. He was now Emperor Napoleon I. He was 35 years old. The empire he now commanded stretched across most of Europe in some form. France itself was vastly expanded. His brothers and sisters were placed on the thrones of kingdoms across the continent. Joseph in Naples, then Spain, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia, Murat, his brother-in-law, in Naples after Joseph moved to Spain. It was a system of dynastic management unprecedented in modern history, and it was deeply flawed, because these relatives, whom Napoleon could control in Paris, often proved obdurate, incompetent, or disloyal once seated on their own thrones. The great battles of the imperial period are the stuff of military legend. Austerlitz, fought in December of 1805 in Moravia, is still taught in military academies around the world as perhaps the greatest single tactical victory in the history of warfare. Facing the combined armies of Austria and Russia under Emperors Francis and Alexander, Napoleon performed a deception that required absolute nerves of steel. He deliberately weakened his right flank to invite the enemy attack, concentrating his real strength on the center and his left, then struck the enemy center as they extended themselves, trying to turn his apparently vulnerable right. The Allied line was shattered. Thousands drowned in the frozen ponds of the Pratzen Plateau. 36,000 enemy soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. French losses were around 9,000. It was a masterpiece. In 1806, he smashed Prussia at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt in a single day. In 1807, he defeated Russia at Friedland and met Tsar Alexander I on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, a meeting of extraordinary symbolic grandeur, to sign the Treaty of Tilsit, which reorganized much of Europe and made Russia and France, briefly, allies. At Tilsit, Napoleon was at the absolute zenith of his power. He controlled, directly or indirectly, most of the European continent west of Russia. He had defeated every major power. The British, protected by their island and their navy, his greatest strategic frustration, remained undefeated. It was Britain's stubborn continued resistance that led Napoleon to his continental system, the attempt to blockade Britain economically by forbidding all European ports under French influence from trading with the British. It was strategically coherent but politically catastrophic. It hurt French allies and neutral parties as much as it hurt Britain. It required constant enforcement. It led to friction with Portugal, then Spain, then eventually Russia. The three fractures that would eventually bring everything down. The Peninsula War in Spain and Portugal, begun in 1808, became what Napoleon himself later called his Spanish ulcer. He had forced the Spanish Bourbons to abdicate and placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. The Spanish people rose in a furious national uprising that combined guerrilla warfare, British military support under the future Duke of Wellington, and the particular savage determination of people fighting to protect their culture, religion, and independence. It was a war for which Napoleon's kind of warfare, the decisive battle, the destroyed enemy army, the peace treaty, was almost entirely unsuited. There was no decisive battle to win when every village was a fortress and every Spanish peasant a potential enemy. The war dragged on for years, consuming French armies and French generals at an appalling rate, bleeding France steadily, exhausting resources that would be desperately needed elsewhere. Meanwhile, Napoleon's personal life was about to change irrevocably. In 1809, he made the decision he had long postponed and could not put off any longer. He divorced Josephine. It was one of the most painful moments of his life, and by the accounts of everyone present, deeply painful for her too. He told her that the needs of France, the necessity of an heir, required that he marry again. He reportedly wept. She reportedly fainted. He provided for her generously. She retained her title as Empress, her properties, an enormous income, and he visited her still. but the marriage that had defined his emotional life for 13 years was over. In 1810, he married Marie-Louise, the 18-year-old Archduchess of Austria, daughter of the Emperor Francis, who had lost to him at Austerlitz. It was the most politically ironic marriage imaginable, the Corsican revolutionary marrying into the oldest royal house in Europe. Marie-Louise was young, docile, and fertile. In 1811, she gave Napoleon his longed-for son, Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles Bonaparte, immediately named the King of Rome. Napoleon was 41 years old. He had his heir. He was also, though he could not yet see it clearly, beginning to overreach. The empire was vast but not stable. The continental system was straining alliances. The Spanish ulcer was bleeding France, and Tsar Alexander I, feeling the economic pressure of the continental system and chafing under what he increasingly saw as French domination, was drifting back toward trading with Britain. In 1812, Napoleon launched the greatest military expedition in history to that point. The Grande Armée, 600,000 soldiers from across the continent, invaded Russia. It was a decision driven by strategic necessity. Russia had to be forced back into compliance with the continental system. But it was also, in retrospect, the decision that killed the empire. The Russian campaign was an experience of almost biblical horror. The Russian army under General Kutuzov refused to be trapped into the decisive battle Napoleon needed. They retreated and retreated and retreated across the vast Russian plain, burning their own crops and villages as they went, denying the French an enemy to destroy and a land from which to forage. The French advanced through scorching summer heat, and then, as September arrived, through killing cold. Men died of thirst, of hunger, of heat exhaustion, then of frostbite. The logistics that had always been Napoleon's weakness, his armies had always lived partly off the land, became catastrophic. The Battle of Borodino, fought on the 7th of September 1812, on a gentle plain near Moscow, was the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had his decisive battle at last. He won it, barely, and at enormous cost. Over 70,000 men were killed or wounded on both sides in a single day of savage fighting. The Russian army retreated in good order. Napoleon entered Moscow a week later to find it deserted and largely burning. The Russians had set fire to their own ancient capital rather than yield it intact to the French. Napoleon sat in the ruins of Moscow for 5 weeks, waiting for Alexander to ask for peace. Alexander never came. And as October turned toward November and the Russian winter began in earnest, Napoleon faced the truth that he had lost. He ordered the retreat. What followed was one of the most terrible episodes in military history. The Grande Armée retreated through Russian winter on roads it had already stripped bare. The temperature fell to -30 degrees and below. Men froze to death standing. Horses collapsed and were immediately eaten by desperate soldiers. The Cossack cavalry harassed the French flanks and rear without mercy, cutting off stragglers, destroying supply columns, riding down men too exhausted to defend themselves. The Grande Armée had entered Russia with 600,000 soldiers. It came home with fewer than 100,000 who could still fight. Napoleon had left the army before its final agony, racing back to Paris in secret to prevent a coup. He arrived in December of 1812 and immediately began rebuilding. It was a demonstration of extraordinary willpower and organizational ability, raising new armies from the ground up, conscripting young men who had barely finished school, forging new alliances, managing the political fallout of catastrophe. He was not done. Not yet. But the coalition against him was gathering strength and confidence. Prussia rose against him. Austria joined the coalition despite being his father-in-law's kingdom and his wife's homeland. The Battle of Leipzig in October of 1813, the Battle of the Nations, the largest battle in history to that point, with over 500,000 soldiers on the field, ended in French defeat. Napoleon's army, outnumbered and outmaneuvered at last, retreated across the Rhine. In the early months of 1814, Napoleon fought a brilliant defensive campaign in France itself. The 6 Days Campaign is still admired by military historians as a masterpiece of economy and improvisation, a small force defeating larger armies piecemeal through speed and deception. He was fighting at his tactical best even as the strategic situation was utterly hopeless. The coalition armies were converging on Paris from multiple directions with overwhelming numbers. His marshals, exhausted by 20 years of war, drained of their former fire, negotiated behind his back. Paris fell. The Senate declared him deposed. And in April of 1814, in a chateau at Fontainebleau where he had often stayed at the height of his glory, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated. The abdication was followed by a moment of private hell that he almost did not survive. Knowing that the war was lost, that he would be separated from his son, Marie-Louise was already moving toward her father's court in Austria, taking the young King of Rome with her and facing an uncertain future. Napoleon took a vial of poison that he had been carrying since the Russian campaign. The dose, a combination of opium, belladonna, and white hellebore, had apparently degraded in potency during 2 years in his pocket. It made him violently ill but did not kill him. He survived the night. By morning, the crisis had passed. He never spoke of it. The coalition's terms were unexpectedly generous, a reflection of how terrifying this man still was. He was allowed to keep his title of emperor, to be given sovereignty over the small Mediterranean island of Elba just off the Tuscan coast, to receive a pension, to be accompanied by a small guard. The island of Elba. It was an almost absurdist fate for the man who had ruled most of Europe. He arrived at Elba in May of 1814. He was 44 years old. He set about governing his tiny kingdom, a few thousand inhabitants, with the same organizational energy he had brought to France. He inspected roads. He reorganized the island's small government. He improved the iron mines. He created a small army, a small navy. He reviewed his troops with the same attention he had once given to the Grande Armée. To observers, it seemed tragic and somewhat comic. To Napoleon, it was perhaps simply what he did. He organized, he administered, he commanded. It was who he was. But he was also watching France, and what he saw, from the short distance across the sea from the Tuscan coast, alarmed and excited him. The restored Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, brother of the guillotined Louis XVI, was unpopular. The army was demoralized. Many French people looked at the awkward, goat-ridden king and his émigré court, who had apparently learned nothing and forgotten nothing, as Talleyrand famously put it, and felt something like despair. The old regime was not literally restored, but its spirit seemed to be creeping back. Veterans of the imperial armies were humiliated and unemployed. The country that had been told it was the greatest in the world felt diminished and defeated. And then, in late February of 1815, Napoleon simply sailed away from Elba with 1,000 soldiers. He landed on the French coast near Cannes on the 1st of March, and what happened next was one of the most astonishing events in the history of any country. The Bourbon king sent armies to stop him. They met Napoleon on the road, muskets loaded, bayonets fixed. And Napoleon walked toward them alone. He opened his coat and said, according to his own account and the testimony of witnesses, "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish." The soldiers lowered their muskets. Then they raised them in salute. Then they cheered. One by one, regiment by regiment, the armies sent to stop him joined him instead. Within 3 weeks of landing, Napoleon was in Paris. Louis XVIII had fled. The imperial government was restored. The 100 Days had begun, but the coalition powers, convening in Vienna to redraw the map of Europe, had no intention of living with Napoleon again. They mobilized their armies immediately. Napoleon had perhaps 3 months to build a force and strike before they were ready. He moved with his old speed. The Waterloo campaign of June 1815 was Napoleon's last. He invaded the territory now called Belgium with around 120,000 soldiers, attempting to defeat the Allied British and Prussian armies separately before they could unite. He nearly succeeded. He won at Ligny, defeating the Prussians under Field Marshal Blücher on the 16th of June. He sent his cavalry commander Grouchy in pursuit of the retreating Prussians, a critical decision because Grouchy spent the next 2 days marching in the wrong direction, finding and fighting a rearguard while the main Prussian army regrouped and marched toward a place called Waterloo. On the 18th of June, Napoleon attacked the Anglo-Dutch army of the Duke of Wellington, drawn up along a ridge near the village of Waterloo in modern Belgium. Wellington's defensive position was strong. The gentle ridge of Mont Saint-Jean concealed his reserves and gave his men protection, and Wellington himself was one of the few commanders Napoleon had never met who was his equal in nerve and tactical intelligence. The battle lasted all day. The French attacks came in waves and were beaten back. Late in the afternoon, as the French were making their final great assault with the Imperial Guard, those veteran units who had never lost a major engagement, the Prussian army arrived on Napoleon's eastern flank. The Imperial Guard, advancing in their tall bearskin hats through the smoke and carnage of the battlefield, was met by withering volley fire from Wellington's infantry. For the first time in their history, the Guard broke and retreated. And when the word spread through the French army that the Guard had retreated, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. It was as though the founding myth of the empire, that this army, led by this man, was invincible, dissolved in a moment. The French army disintegrated. Men threw down their weapons and ran. Napoleon himself was nearly captured in the chaos. He rode from the field of Waterloo with his empire in ruins around him. He returned to Paris, abdicated again, this time without resistance, and made his way to the Atlantic coast, hoping to escape to America. The British Navy blocked every port. He eventually surrendered to a British warship, the Bellerophon, in July of 1815. He had apparently hoped for asylum in England, the nation he had fought for 15 years, and he may even have believed it was possible. The British government had other ideas. They consulted their allies and chose his new prison with care. St. Helena, a volcanic island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, 1,600 miles from the nearest coastline, 2,000 miles from Africa, 4,000 miles from Europe. It was, as one British official put it, the most isolated piece of inhabited land in the world. There was no escaping from St. Helena. Napoleon arrived there in October of 1815. He was 45 years old. He had 6 years left to live, and he would spend all of them on that island. St. Helena was not a comfortable exile. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, was a conscientious, suspicious, and deeply humorless man who saw his job as preventing Napoleon's escape at all costs and interpreted that mission with a bureaucratic rigidity that made daily life for the prisoner and his household a series of petty humiliations. Lowe controlled access to newspapers and correspondence. He insisted on Napoleon's guards physically observing him at set times each day to verify he hadn't escaped. He reduced the household's budget repeatedly. He refused to address Napoleon as emperor, calling him General Bonaparte instead, which Napoleon found deeply offensive and which precipitated a series of furious confrontations and then, finally, simply a refusal to meet with Lowe at all. For the last years of his life, Napoleon and his jailer communicated almost entirely through intermediaries. The house Napoleon lived in, Longwood House, was damp, infested with rats, and unsuited to habitation. It sat in the cloudiest, foggiest part of the island. The climate was notoriously unhealthy, not the tropical lushness of other Atlantic islands, but a peculiar combination of dampness and heat that promoted illness. Napoleon was visibly aging. His hair went from the close-cropped dark locks of the imperial portraits to thin, disordered strands. His body, once lean and vigorous, began to grow soft and heavy. He suffered from chronic stomach pain that his physicians treated uncertainly and that would eventually be identified, in retrospect, as the cancer of the stomach that would kill him. But within those constraints, he created a kind of intellectual life. He dictated his memoirs. He created a version of himself and of his career that was carefully crafted for posterity, a version that emphasized his liberal intentions, his role as the heir of the revolution, his desire for European unity, his victimization by the old powers of Europe. He dictated the Memorial de Sainte-Hélène with Lescasse, one of his courtiers, who would later publish the work and make it a sensation. In those dictations, Napoleon created what historians call the Napoleonic legend, a romantic, heroic narrative of a great man brought low by smaller men and the jealousy of nations who had wanted only peace and had been forced into wars by the implacable enmity of England. It was not entirely dishonest. There were genuine liberal elements to his legacy. The Napoleonic Code, the meritocratic elements of his system, the abolition of serfdom and feudal privilege in territories he conquered, the spreading of revolutionary ideas of civic equality across Europe. These things were real, but the legend also glossed over the authoritarian nature of his rule, the enormous destruction of life that his wars caused. Estimates suggest that 3.5 million soldiers died in the Napoleonic Wars, and civilian casualties from disease, famine, and disruption may have doubled that number, and the fundamental truth that much of his career was driven by a personal ambition so towering that it is impossible to fully separate it from any of his political idealism. He played chess, badly and impatiently, as he always had. He read history, novels, anything that reached him on the island. He gardened, apparently with some enthusiasm, in the grounds around Longwood. He took the air on horseback when his health permitted, or in a carriage when it did not. He often wore the same uniform he had worn at the height of the empire, the gray overcoat of the campaigning years, the small black hat, as though clothing himself still in the authority that had been stripped away. Visitors who came to St. Helena and managed to secure permission to see him were struck by how completely he still looked the part. Even in exile, even aging and unwell, he projected the force of a man accustomed to commanding. He talked about his son constantly. The King of Rome, now in Vienna at the Austrian court of his grandfather Francis, had been renamed Franz and was being raised as an Austrian prince, entirely cut off from his French heritage. Napoleon received almost no news of him. He kept a portrait of the child in his rooms and referred to him with an aching tenderness that contrasted sharply with the imperial confidence of everything else in his manner. "My son," he would say to his household. Just that, "my son." He also talked about Josephine. News had reached him at Elba that she had died in May of 1814, just weeks after his first abdication, almost as though the separation had been too much to sustain. He had reportedly been devastated. On St. Helena, he returned to her memory again and again, idealizing the relationship in retrospect, in a way that perhaps revised its more painful realities. He told his companions that she had been the great love of his life. He asked that her name be among his last words. Perhaps from the safe distance of exile, it was easier to see what he had had in her, and what the divorce had cost them both. In the final years on St. Helena, his health declined steadily and visibly. He suffered from constant stomach pain, from nausea, from a weakness that he fought against with everything he had but could no longer entirely conceal. His household watched in silent grief as the most energetic man any of them had ever known grew quieter, slower, thinner, and then paradoxically heavier as his metabolism changed. He died on the 5th of May, 1821. His last reported words in their delirium touched on the things that had defined him: France, the army, Josephine, the head of his army, his son. He was 51 years old. The cause of death, accepted by most historians for many years, was stomach cancer. More recently, a theory has emerged based on analyses of Napoleon's hair, which preserved elevated levels of arsenic, that he may have been slowly poisoned. The debate continues. The wallpaper at Longwood, containing arsenic-based green dye that could release toxic vapors in damp conditions, is another possible source of the accumulated arsenic. Whether by illness, by accident, or by design, Napoleon died on that South Atlantic island, far from everything he had loved and built. He was buried on St. Helena with military honors, in a simple grave in a valley near a spring he had liked. His will was a remarkable document, detailed, generous to his household and his old companions, and containing passages of self-justification and political testament that were clearly intended for posterity. He wrote that he died in the Catholic faith, though his relationship to religion remained as complicated and instrumental in death as it had been in life. He wrote that he wished his ashes to rest on the banks of the Seine, among the French people he had loved. That wish would eventually be honored. In 1840, the July monarchy of Louis-Philippe negotiated with the British for Napoleon's remains. A French warship sailed to St. Helena, disinterred the coffin. Those present were astonished to find that the body was almost perfectly preserved after nearly 20 years, and brought it home. On the 15th of December 1840, Napoleon was brought back to Paris in a ceremonial procession of extraordinary grandeur. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the route. Veterans of the old army, many of them elderly and infirm, wept openly. The coffin was brought to Les Invalides, the great military hospital, beneath whose golden dome it rests to this day, in a sarcophagus of red porphyry from Finland, set on a pedestal of green granite from the Vosges, in a circular crypt so designed that all who enter must bow slightly to see the tomb. Napoleon had arranged his own apotheosis, and death cooperated. What then do we make of this man? He was a genius, not a word to be used casually, but the only honest word here. His intelligence was extraordinary. The speed of his thinking, the spatial capacity, the ability to manage complexity, to remember detail, to inspire, and to organize. His energy was almost inhuman. In the peak years of his power, he was managing wars, governing an empire, reforming institutions, corresponding with dozens of officials simultaneously, and reviewing his armies personally. He did all of this on 4 hours of sleep and extraordinary willpower. He was also, by any reasonable moral accounting, responsible for enormous destruction, millions of deaths, the devastation of multiple generations of European young men, the suppression of the freedoms his career was supposed to embody: press freedom, political freedom, the right to oppose the government, crushed under a secret police, a censored press, and the demand for absolute loyalty. He was capable of great personal cruelty when he felt threatened. The execution of the Dutengengen in 1804, a Bourbon prince seized on foreign soil and shot without proper trial, was an act of political murder that shocked Europe, and that Napoleon himself acknowledged privately was an error, though he never publicly expressed remorse. His re-imposition of slavery in the French colonies in 1802 was a grotesque reversal of revolutionary principle, born of colonial economic calculation, that condemned hundreds of thousands of people to bondage. He contained contradictions that perhaps no single frame can fully contain. Revolutionary and autocrat, liberator and conqueror, builder and destroyer, man of the Enlightenment and servant of his own ambition. He wanted to be loved, and he made himself feared. He wanted peace, and he made perpetual war. He wanted an empire that would last, and he drove it to ruins in a decade. The world he helped make, however, that world persists. The Napoleonic Code underlies the legal systems of France, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Romania, Louisiana, Quebec, and dozens of other jurisdictions. The concept of the modern European state, with its bureaucratic rationality, its secular institutions, its national army and national identity, owes more to Napoleon than to almost any other single individual. The very idea of nationalism, the powerful, dangerous, world-shaping idea that people of shared language and culture should govern themselves, was released across Europe by Napoleonic conquest, including by the resentment of Napoleonic conquest. The nations that rose against him were in many cases becoming nations, forging their identities in the furnace of resistance. Germany, Spain, Italy, their modern national stories are inseparable from Napoleon. His shadow falls across everything, over every great general who has come since, measured against his standard, over every politician who has dreamed of remaking a continent, over every romantic who has seen in human ambition something both magnificent and doomed. He has been, depending on the moment and the observer, the tyrant, The hero, the modernizer, the monster, the genius, the victim. He was, above all, a human being. Born in a fragrant, rugged Mediterranean island in the last summer of a dying era, raised in poverty and exile and cold French academies, forged in war and revolution, lifted to a height no man before him had reached in the modern age, and brought back down, as all men eventually are, by time, by hubris, by the limits of what one human being, however extraordinary, can hold against the whole weight of the world. He wanted his ashes on the banks of the Seine, among the French people he had loved, and so they are, and in the great circular crypt beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, on 12 victory trophies engraved with the names of his battles, Austerlitz, Rivoli, the Pyramids, Marengo, Wagram, Friedland, Jena, Montebello. His red stone sarcophagus waits in perfect stillness. Above the entrance to the crypt, carved in stone, are his own words. I wish that my ashes may rest on the banks of the Seine, in the midst of the French people whom I have loved so much. For a man who spent his life in motion, who crossed the Alps, the desert, the Russian steppe, the Atlantic, it is perhaps the only rest he ever truly found.